I'm going to play now audio tour of this map. It is narrated by Kate Crawford that worked with me on this one. We basically, together with Cristo and many other wonderful people, collaborated in this project Knowing Machine. And this project was part of Knowing Machine, probably the weirdest part of it, like some kind of art part. And a lot of thanks to Milutin and Oli for making this web version possible. I will explain also some kind of technical aspects of it maybe later. Let's try with this.
That data is then used to train algorithms and models that have their own histories, which are programmed and processed by human computers and crowd workers. It is all powered by energy-intensive computational hardware that is expanding exponentially in multiple directions, from hyperscale data centers to biological computing to quantum. The themes of control and classification begin with time as a concept that orders human actions and labor, to education as another structuring process, to the ideas of emotions and intelligence and the shaping of the human body itself. We see those practices of classification and control in biometrics and medical information, through to the disciplinary systems of prisons and policing. Borders and bureaucracy trace the movements of people and information, which brings us to the heart of the map: colonialism and the paths of empires over history, with their accompanying political and economic ideologies that drive production and energy extraction. Next, we see the strata of planetary classification, from the mineral layer of the lithosphere all the way up to the astrosphere. Then we consider space in other ways, how mapping and architecture are themselves systems of control. The final sections consider the many layers of militarized power, from surveillance technologies to doctrines to centuries of military systems. Every reading is different, and you're invited to draw your own connections. Hundreds of individual drawings and texts span centuries of conflict, enclosure, and control. We suggest taking your time, a radical act in an era of speed and simplification. A close examination of these patterns over several centuries reveals the ascendance of certain ideas and technologies, the concentration of power and wealth, and the colonization of land, infrastructure, and human life worlds. In this visual history, we see how the past is contained in the present and how the future could be made otherwise.
All right. Yeah. So, okay, just to give you some kind of insight how we started to do this and why, and basically in the beginning it was, if you maybe saw Anatomy of an AI System, our previous collaboration. So it have this kind of backbone that starts with an object. In that time it was a Amazon Echo device, and then we deep dive through this kind of extended anatomy that goes from object into communication networks, and then data centers, and then we dive into algorithms that are inside of data centers. We dive into data organization structures. We dive into labor, and then into Earth. No? And basically this map is the same thing. It have a same logic. So if you go from the left, it is the same. This upper part is basically communication devices, and then you go into interface, then you go into communication infrastructure, data organization, algorithms, models, hardware, and so on. And then the other map, the other part of the map, is basically how those structures are basically being embedded into different kinds of control and classification systems. So we have a time, education, emotions, human bodies, biometrics, medical, prison, policing, borders, bureaucracy, political systems, architecture, surveillance, military. No? So they're supposed to be one across each other, and to reflect each other in a way. And in the beginning, it was like, okay, it started to be fun, but when you start to deep dive into those like histories, it is really complex story. And for me, the most interesting one that I didn't basically thought so much, and it is really related to what Christo was speaking about. It is basically history of classification. So I spend a lot of time trying to understand how we classify the world from 1500s until today. Because at the end, if you dig into data sets or models that Christo was explaining, at the end, there is some kind of classification matrix. You need to have some kind of classification matrix as a matrix for labeling data set or organizing data set. And then for me, this kind of like understanding the history of classification was like the most interesting part, because you start, I mean, like for example, with classification of nature, and you have this guy Linnaeus who classified all the plants. But then in one moment he switched, or he started to think about, okay, what about humans? If we classified all the types of animals, then we should also try to classify humans. So in one of his books, there are 5 different types of human beings. That's basically 5 races. But it goes parallelly for us. What was like really interesting, it is to go always parallelly with systems of power. So this is the time when you have like European colonialism expanding, and you have this parallel with that birth of scientific reasoning and scientific method. So basically you are trying in some way to use a scientific method that say, okay, let's now classify everything that we have around, but it is in the same time tool to somehow, let's say, give a justice for all of those atrocities that were happening. And you are saying, okay, we are not the same. And this is why there is 5 types of human beings, and the 3rd and 4th and 5th are maybe not so important as the 1st and the 2nd one. And this is what you always see when you start to go from there. You always see this kind of relation of systems of classification and power, And also from the same stream, you have a birth of I don't know, physical anthropology that is to say, okay, now we are continuing this obsession with quantifying everything, And it's the same thing with the AI now. We are quantifying human beings. We are measuring human skulls. We are measuring how tall they are, and then we are applying some kind of really fuzzy logic, saying, okay, the size of the skull means that someone is more clever or someone is. And we can also look at those kind of examples through many different fields, like classification of human beings, of like body, classification of intelligence. And then you see, for example, there is a patterns of like always you have a situations. Once you have this kind of crazy idea of classifying human beings or intelligence of human beings, usually it's first being used in prison systems, on borders, and all of those things. So, for example, the first big use of like quantifying human intelligence through IQ tests were like being used in military systems, but also on borders. So, for example, on Ellis Island, when you are immigrating in the United States, you needed to fill some kind of IQ test, and if you are not on the scale, then you are being put back. But then you understand that each of those systems of classification are coming from somebody history, someone point of view. So somehow the people from the north were getting better results than Italians, people from Balkans, and so on, so on. So you start basically critically to read these kind of systems of classification, but they go in parallel with media. No, so for me, if you scroll here on the left side of the map, and this map it's really not for 20 minutes. That's clear. No, so it takes an hour, and this is why maybe it's radical in a sense that it takes a lot of time. It takes to dive in. It takes to take time and think about it. So then if you start, because we also did this kind of like a archaeology of media, then you really see how, in order to do mass biometrics of faces, you needed to have a photography as a medium. So there are always links between the birth of medium and how this medium is being embedded in a different political context or context of control. And my love for this kind of, I remember when we were doing this early Share Labs investigations, I always wanted to have this kind of like analysis from the past, and it was always this kind of like 1850s as a some kind of like time when a lot of things are happening. So, for example, if you look at this line, this is like 1850s. You have, we think that we are now in some kind of like the age of magic. Everything is magic around AI and whatever. But if you think about like 1850s to 1900s, this is the real magic. In a sense of like, this is like really tectonic changes. In a sense of like, I don't know, before phonograph, there was no voice being recorded. So we have thousands of years without recorded voice. But in the same time, look at this: phonograph, radio, telephone, telegraph, typewriter. This was like really some kind of like hardcore birth of new media. No, not 2000s or whatever when we think about interactive media. But no. That was like 1850s, 1900s beginning, when we had a situation in which you had like before that, I don't know, you needed like 2 or 3, 4 weeks for one letters to come from one continent to another, and suddenly you have a real-time communication network. So that was like really, but what is like really interesting for me in this research was like to try to understand how for each of those media, basically how the power it's embedded in. And so, for example, if you think about like the time before voice was like recorded, it was completely different feeling. You have a band, you go around, and the voice goes with your body, and then suddenly the voice is embedded into some kind of plastic, and start to travel without you. And then around that media, you have a lot of parasites like managers, publishing houses, building their own industry, and artists is like being left there. But okay, as artists feel, okay, when I go to the next city, they know me. And this is typical, the same thing what we have now with the internet and reputation economy and AI and everything. They say, okay, maybe I'm not getting anything of it, but how many likes I have, like so many people are listening to my music. They say, oh, good you. But there is a basically ecosystem around it. So in a way, we can somehow, if we start to critically analyze all of those media, we can find like so many different stories that are basically absolutely the same systems that we have today. And then, for example, for me, it was like some parts were like more interesting than others. I was thinking, okay, history of the infrastructure, because now it's clear. Okay, you have a networks, you have these towers of like mobile systems. But then, how those infrastructures were in the past, and we did a lot of like thinking about, I don't know, postal systems as a networks, like as some kind of predecessors of like the infrastructure that we have now. And then again, you have a same story. This is the story about the stamp. How basically in UK back then you had, I don't know, many different small this kind of like courier systems, independent of the state, going around selling, bringing letters, and you were able to exchange like 4 different mails in one day. So it's some kind of birth of social media back then. But then again, there was some kind of like terrorist, whatever, attack, secret services, and they said like, okay, we need to conquer this space. And what they did, they invented the post stamp. They lowered the price from, I don't know, 10 cents or whatever to 1 penny. So this is why it's called like penny black. And by doing that, they centralized all the communication. And in the same moment, you have a birth of some structure. It's called the black room, in which basically all of the letters are coming through one same room. And what they do metadata collection. So it's a birth of metadata collection, because what is on the stamp, what is on the letter is basically metadata from who, date, whatever, the same metadata that we have in emails today. So if you go back in the past, you will see the same things, the birth of same things and same kind of power relations that always goes. I remember when we were like doing this investigation of like, I don't know, Serbian internet service providers. And then you have this relation between government and internet service provider. This is the same thing, same relations that existed in 1700s and 1600s between the state and the infrastructures, you know. So it's for me, it was like super interesting to deep dive into it. And then this part, it's about like history of basically data collection and data organization. So what it even means. And then you see again the same power structures. You see which countries were brought the concept of museum, brought the concept of archiving. So again, it's a UK, the same, you know, like power structures that exist today. But this concept of archiving is also really related with the colonial explorations, okay, the however they call that, going around and numbering everything, collecting everything, and bringing everything to British Museum. No? So it is basically the same way as today, it is a theft of cultural history. So what ChatGPT or OpenAI are doing, it's a theft of cultural history. They took all the books that exist in the same way that British did in many hundred years ago. And then it's a super interesting story how data is being like organized. So for example, before, again, combination of one medium, for example, printing press, before printing press, you didn't have like numeration of the pages. You didn't have a content page at all because you didn't need it. You didn't have the scale of books. You didn't, and each of book was handwritten. So you don't have this system of organizing knowledge. And then once you have a printing press, then you need, you know, numeration of pages, content pages, and all of those as a technologies of knowledge organization, page layout, pagination, everything. No? So it's really interesting to think how in history we were like organizing data, and how basically for me, like, you know, they completely, this history of librarianism, it's completely forgotten now in a sense, but it's a core history of computer science. Computer science doesn't come from computers, it comes from libraries, organization of knowledge and systematization of knowledge and stuff like this. Another completely crazy one, but I will not go into it, is history of statistics and history of basically algorithms. I had a lot of fun with this. It was hard, but but it is, and it is also like really interesting to think about again these kind of parallels, like when you have a birth of statistics and a birth of probability, you have in relation again with the colonial expansion, because the idea, and again with the systems as an insurance. You know, probability is about insurance. You know, so you are sending 5 ships. 3 of them are coming back, but what is the frequency of these? So that you need to calculate the cost of ships that are not going to come back into your business, and then you have basically a birth of statistical thinking and statistical reasoning, because it was needed for a capitalism to expand. So basically, so on. So you have like really crazy stories about like, for example, regression as a statistical system of it is like, for example, first visualized by Galton. Galton also is a really infamous guy that is kind of in the root of eugenics So this kind of regression was like related into like counting human beings and how they will reproduce and who we need to like put away and so it's like super interesting to read those kind of parallel stories that are most of the time hidden from us. And then basically this second map, it's really hardcore. It is about like how we classified bodies, how we are classifying race as a taxonomic concept, different, gender-related things, eugenics. You see the history basically of not misunderstanding. You see that the classification systems are constantly changing. So the classification system that we have in this moment are basically constantly changing, and we are constantly being wrong. In like, I don't know, 50 or 100 years ago, we were thinking the gender, it's like just like two options, and it's not an option, it's a line. Basically, it's a spectrum. Now it's even not a spectrum. Now it's like some kind of space that you can jump around. Now it's a dynamic thing, but all of those are basically classification systems. And yeah, that are basically being embedded into different kinds. So we have like history of prisons laboratories, prisons as a concept, panopticon, everything. Yeah, I'm inviting you to browse this. It is really maybe weird experience because it's not even organized as a database. Because like you have, for example, in some moments here in the map, you have like moments of like really precise data, like date, time, but then in combination with some kind of abstractions and visual representation, combination of like some kind of philosophical comments together with factual data. So it is really some kind of like a huge non-linear, multi-dimensional storytelling device about critical history of relation between technology and power.